Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes the most unassuming documents, they hide the most profound implications. Imagine getting an email, subject line, treated prevalence and health expenditures among children with autism spectrum disorder. Sounds like the kind of dry government data that, usually goes straight to the spam folder, right? Maybe even gets deleted unopened. But what if I told you that this seemingly neutral data, tucked away in a statistical brief, holds a truly chilling message about how we as a society value human lives?
It's true. That email leads us to Statistical Brief, #565, published by the U.S. Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, that's AHRQ, in August 2025. As our source material keenly observes, it was released quite quietly, actually, right when government offices are gearing up for what they call budget season. So today our mission is to peel back the layers of this document. We're going far beyond just the numbers. We want to uncover the historical, economic, and political currents that shape how society views, categorizes, and ultimately costs autism. We want to understand what this brief really says about who counts and, critically, who gets left behind.
Okay, so the core question we'll be exploring is this. How does a simple spreadsheet, filled with what looks like just facts and figures, how does that transform into what our source calls a performance piece in the theater of governance? Something that effectively prepares the ground for policy decisions that have profound real-world human implications. It's definitely much more than just data. Let's jump straight into what those numbers actually say, because that's really where the conversation kicks off. The AHRQ brief focuses specifically on children with treated autism. Now, it's important to understand how they define that. It's quite narrow, meaning those with at least one coded healthcare event tied to the F84 diagnostic category. For anyone not steeped in medical codes, F84 is the standard international classification for autism spectrum disorders. And what the brief reports is that these children cost the healthcare system, on average, over $20,000 per year.
$20,000. And that figure isn't just a number sitting there. It immediately sets up a stark comparison. The brief highlights that this is nearly 10 times the expenditure for children without such coded treatment. 10 times. What's truly fascinating and frankly troubling in the source's analysis is what the brief doesn't mention. There's no consideration for broader crucial elements like, say, educational support or community care, or even the systemic barriers that many people face just trying to access services. There's absolutely no discussion about whether the services provided are adequate or appropriate or genuinely affirming for autistic individuals. The entire narrative, really, from beginning to end, is strictly economic. We just see expenditures, percentages, differences across age, sex, poverty, insurance status, that sort of thing.
So if the focus is purely on the economic side, what's the human cost of framing it like that?
Precisely. That's the question. The consequence of this framing is that the child, the actual person, effectively disappears from the discussion. What remains is just a raw cost. As our source powerfully puts it, it's an old story, just in new formatting. It's a very specific, and you could argue, a very limited lens.
When we hear terms like eugenics, our minds often go to, well, a dark chapter from a bygone era, right? Safely in the past, something we learned about in history class and have thankfully moved on from. But our source makes a compelling and frankly quite unsettling argument that it never truly went away. It just learned to code switch, to adapt its language and its methods.
It's a really powerful point, and if you trace the history, you see these clear parallels. Back in the late 19th and early 20th century, the American eugenics movement explicitly framed individuals they deemed defective as a burden to the taxpayer. That was the language. Institutions like the infamous Cold Spring Harbor Eugenics Record Office meticulously cataloged conditions like feeble-mindedness and even included detailed cost projections. This economic language, this focus on cost, it was central to justifying practices that horrify us today, like forced sterilization, segregation, institutionalization. For instance, 32 U.S. states actually passed sterilization laws based on a straightforward, almost brutal cost-benefit rationale. They were asking, why should the taxpayer bear the cost of another generation of dependents?
Wow, that's a chilling question, and it really just underscores the economic core of that whole movement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this logic, it reached its most egregious legal expression in the landmark Buck v. Bill Supreme Court case in 1927. That's where forced sterilization was upheld. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for the majority, delivered a line that, as our source highlights, still hangs like a shadow over disability law today. He wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It's a stark reminder that this ruling, as of this writing, has never actually been overturned.
The historical context is just Yeah, incredibly unsettling. So when you look at this current AHRQ brief through that historical lens, does the source see direct parallels, even if the language is more subtle now?
Exactly. That's the argument. The source argues that while the brief's language is, yes, careful, technical, scrubbed of overt ideology, it nevertheless echoes that same ruling from nearly a century ago. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the spreadsheet in this analysis is presented as maybe a softer tool than the scalpel of the past. But its fundamental function is strikingly similar. It's a way of drawing a line around who counts, who costs too much, and who is deemed worthy, essentially, to take up space in a public system. The profound concern here is that this brief, released now in the current political climate, prepares the ground for a potential policy retreat. A retreat where cost-cutting becomes a kind of coded justification for exclusion. The source really emphasizes that framing autism as purely an economic liability isn't apolitical at all. It's strategic. It's seen as a historical continuation of what they describe as eugenic governance by other means.
So this obsession with quantifying human worth, it didn't just vanish when overt eugenics was discredited after World War II. It sounds like it just morphed, taking on new shapes within public health, education, social welfare programs, particularly in the mid-20th century.
That's precisely what the source suggests happened. The post-war bureaucracy, with the rise of programs like Social Security Disability Insurance, Medicaid, and later the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, it shifted. Instead of aiming for the outright elimination of perceived difference, the focus moved towards managing it within a new kind of budgetary architecture. The core question subtly changed from which lives should be allowed to continue to something more like which lives are worth supporting and, crucially, how much can we afford to spend on them. This new approach led to this elaborate system of categorization by cost. Children were assessed, sorted, placed into what were termed cost-rational categories. And it's crucial to understand that these judgments, while presented professionally, were often, as the source puts it, racialized, classed, and gendered. Our sources indicate that Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and poor children were disproportionately penalized or mislabeled within this system. For autistic children specifically, institutionalization remained common well into the 1970s, and it was often justified by these fiscal assessments. If a child wasn't expected to benefit from instruction in a cost-effective way, well, they were effectively excluded from mainstream support.
Right, that paints a picture of a system becoming more complex, but still fundamentally rooted in these economic valuations. Then we get to the 1980s and the rise of something our source calls neoliberal audit culture. What exactly does that mean? How did that change things again for disability services?
Yeah, that's a really significant shift. With the rise of neoliberalism, the state started to redefine itself, less as a provider of universal care and more as a manager of risk. The priority shifted dramatically towards cost containment and efficiency above almost all else. This meant that disability services weren't just about support anymore. They were reframed through this lens of cost containment and return on investment, ROI. The focus moved away from a child's holistic well-being or their flourishing as a person. Instead, interventions had to be justified on paper, tied to measurable outcomes. The whole idea was to spend money only where you could clearly demonstrate a quantifiable return.
So children who cost more were essentially seen as a liability, a bad investment.
Exactly. High-cost children were increasingly targeted for intervention. Often, intervention designed to normalize behaviors and reduce deviation from the norm. And there was this unspoken but very clear promise hanging in the air. Support would continue only as long as it was deemed cheaper than the perceived alternative, or as long as it could demonstrate some measurable reduction in future costs down the line. The AHRQ brief we're discussing is seen by our source as absolutely saturated in these assumptions, reducing autism in effect to a budget category of fiscal risk. The insidious nature of this, the source highlights, is that the numbers do the delegitimizing on their own. That $20,122 figure isn't just presented as an expense. It implicitly invites conclusions about efficiency and fiscal responsibility, rather than sparking questions about equity or the quality of care or whether needs are actually being met. This quiet folding of care into cost, as the source puts it, leads inevitably to a slow erosion of presence for those deemed too expensive.
Slow erosion of presence. That's a really powerful phrase. Okay, let's pivot slightly to a crucial detail about the timing of this brief because it adds another quite fascinating layer to our understanding. Our source points out that the data window the AHRQ brief analyzes, that's 2018 to 2022, It ends precisely as the DSM-5 text revision, or DSM-5-TR, came into force in March 2022. What's the significance of that overlap? Why does that timing matter?
Yeah, this raises a really important question according to the source. The DSM-5-TR quietly, yet significantly, tightened the diagnostic criteria for autism. It narrowed who would officially qualify under these institutional definitions. What's critical here is that the brief presents its final cost tally under the looser diagnostic regime that existed before these changes were made. Our source describes this as essentially setting the stage, creating a narrative of unsustainable expenditure, which can then be used later to justify restricting access to services once the new, tighter criteria are fully implemented and perhaps diagnoses start to plateau or drop. It's characterized in the material as a prelude to retrenchment taken just before the gates close.
Okay, so can you elaborate just a bit on how the DSM-5-TR tightened those criteria? What were the practical effects of these changes?
Certainly. The DSM-5-TR wasn't like a dramatic overhaul, more of a subtle recalibration. While it was framed by its proponents as an effort to clarify the diagnosis, these shifts placed a greater emphasis on observable functional impairment, and they introduced more rigid behavioral expectations for getting a diagnosis. It also created sharper distinctions, sort of harder lines, between various subgroups within the autism spectrum. The practical result, well, it seems to be reduced diagnostic ambiguity, yes, but also elevated thresholds for who qualifies. Ultimately, a more contained, you could say smaller, diagnostic category. This means, quite simply, fewer people are likely to be labeled with autism under these new rules, and consequently fewer need to be served by the system, at least on paper.
Right. And the human cost of that tightening of the definitions, it means children who don't fit that very specific, often quite male-centric archetype. Thinking about many girls, trans children, multilingual children, racialized children, or maybe non-speaking individuals. They don't disappear from the world, obviously, but they effectively vanish from the official data sets. They're not less autistic, but the system, with its new definitions, may no longer know how to recognize them or how to justify providing them with support.
And that's the combined and potentially devastating effect highlighted in the source. The DSM-5-TR reframes the diagnosis by narrowing who counts, and then the statistical brief reframes the cost by highlighting their expense under the old system. So one defines who is officially recognized. The other implicitly defines what they're worth in economic terms. The outcome, as our source concludes, is depressingly familiar. Fewer diagnosed, fewer served, and more people left behind. Only now, they say, with better spreadsheets. It's presented as a more sophisticated form of gatekeeping.
Okay, so bringing all this together, the history, the economics, the diagnostic changes, what does this all mean for us, for you listening? Why does this deep dive into one statistical brief, this really careful analysis, why does it matter beyond just an academic discussion?
Well, it matters deeply because, as the source argues, this isn't just accounting. It's fundamentally about narrative control. Our source applies something called a power threat meaning framework, or PTMF, to analyze the system itself. Now, for those unfamiliar, the PTMF helps us understand distress not just as an individual problem, but as a response to power dynamics, societal threats, and meaningful experiences. Applying it here suggests the system itself is experiencing a kind of threat, not importantly from autistic people themselves, but, as the source argues, from our refusal to be useful in prescribed ways, our refusal to just assimilate into predefined productivity metrics. So this brief becomes a mechanism of containment. The source identifies a twofold threat facing institutions today. First, a threat to the fiscal legitimacy of the neoliberal state, which, the argument goes, cannot genuinely afford universal care, but also cannot openly admit that. And second, a threat to the epistemic authority of medicalized institutions, basically, their power to define and control the narrative around autism. An authority they are arguably losing as autistic people increasingly speak for themselves and share their own lived experiences, challenging those older narratives.
That connects directly to what our source calls administrative violence, which isn't about overt discrimination, is it? It's more about these quiet, bureaucratic mechanisms, eligibility rules, audits, denials that effectively ration services. It creates a system where, as you quoted, treated ASD becomes the only autism that counts because it's the only one that bills. So what does that mean for the actual realities of autistic people who don't fit neatly into that treated, billable category?
Well, it leads directly to what the source terms narrative erasure. Children or adults whose communication might be primarily relational or emotional or pattern-based, or those who come from multilingual or indigenous communities with different communication norms. They are absolutely present in our world. They're making meaning, living rich lives. But unless their unique forms of being can be translated into these institutionally recognizable formats, think IEP goals, DSM codes, insurance justification forms, They remain effectively invisible to the system providing resources. Their realities aren't seen as errors in the system's design, but rather, the source argues, they are omissions by design. Their lived experience simply isn't factored into the official ledger.
Yeah, it's pretty stark when you realize that this isn't just data crunching. Our source calls this AHRQ brief a moral document, just dressed up carefully in policy language. It's essentially a declaration about whose lives are deemed affordable, and crucially, whose are considered too expensive to accommodate fully. Okay, finally, our source points to the immediate political context of this brief's release. It didn't just appear in a vacuum, right? It emerged under the Trump administration, and notably, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. now heading the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the source material provides a very, very strong characterization of his past positions regarding autism.
That's right. And it's important we're clear we are reporting what the source material says here. The source describes Robert S. Kennedy Jr. as a longtime peddler of anti-autistic conspiracy. It notes he has been quoted as calling autistic existence things like a tragedy, a warning, a signal of environmental collapse. The source highlights that he has framed autistic people as victims, errors, signs of a world gone wrong. Furthermore, the source also characterizes his private history as being steeped in eugenic legacy. So again, it's crucial for listeners to understand, as we discuss this, that these are the direct interpretations and the specific language used in the material we're analyzing today. The source draws these conclusions based on its interpretation of his public statements and the historical context we've just laid out.
Understood. So, according to the source material, then, what are the implications when an agency under that specific leadership releases a brief that seems to reframe autism, not as a culture, not as a community, not even primarily as a medical condition, but mainly as an expenditure, as a cost?
The source's answer is quite stark and cautionary. It suggests it means the old game is back on. But this time, it's dressed in the seemingly neutral language of actuaries and accountants. The history we've traced throughout this deep dive, a history involving sterilization, segregation, statistical containment, the source argues this isn't merely past. It is present, potentially happening again, but through quieter, less overt mechanisms. Mechanisms like tightened diagnostic gates and these kinds of cost-benefit justifications. The ultimate danger, the source warns, isn't just in what the brief explicitly includes, but maybe more importantly in what it prepares the ground for. It doesn't directly say cut support or deny services. No. Instead, it simply states that autism costs 9 times more than other childhood conditions, that the care involved is expensive, and then it sort of leaves the rest to budgets, lawmakers, and agencies to draw their own conclusions. The historical pattern, the source suggests, is unfortunately clear. When the state begins to talk about a specific community primarily in terms of its cost, it is rarely planning to spend more on their support and inclusion.
Wow. This deep dive really makes us reconsider how we look at numbers, doesn't it? It shows us that data isn't always neutral. It can, in fact, be a political act, as the source says, an act that quietly helps decide who gets to exist with support and dignity in our society. So what does it truly mean for us, for our communities, if we allow care to be quietly folded into cost and human value to be ultimately reduced to just another line item on a government spreadsheet?
And maybe consider this final thought from the source. If institutions, as argued here, are feeling threatened by the refusal of autistic people to be simply managed or priced out of existence, then what kind of immense power actually lies in reclaiming our own narratives, in defining our own value, and looking beyond the state's ledger for what it means to lead a full, supported, and meaningful life? It's a powerful reminder, I think, that true understanding often comes from seeing beyond just the visible data points, seeing into the deeper intentions and the profound implications that ultimately shape the world we all live in.